The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
This week on Q&A, author and retired Army Colonel Andrew Bacevich discusses his newly released book titled Breach of Trust: How Americans Failed Their Soldiers and Their Country.
Andrew Bacevich, your new book, Breach of Trust, talks in the beginning some about Vietnam. How much did your time in Vietnam impact what you think today?
Very substantially, although not because my time in Vietnam was toward the end of the war, summer of 70 to summer of 71. And the experience stuck with me less because of anything I experienced as a combat platoon leader, but from what I saw in terms of the decay and deterioration of the Army in which I was serving. And I think that gave me, among other things, an appreciation of the terrible effects of protracted war.
What was your career like? How long were you in the Army?
23 years. I graduated from the military academy in 1969 and served until 1992. There was that year in Vietnam early on, but for the most part I was my experiences were those of a serving officer in the latter part of the Cold War. We thought that we existed to be prepared to fight World War III, and that our readiness to do that would prevent World War III from happening. So I spent 7 years in Germany, and most of the rest of the time in stateside units that would have deployed to Germany in the event of a crisis.
Am I right, 23 years in the service and finished as a lieutenant colonel?
No, colonel.
Full colonel?
Yeah.
Why did you, in the first place, go to West Point? What was the drive for you, and where were you raised?
Well, I was raised in the Midwest. I was born in Illinois and grew up in Indiana. Both my parents were World War II veterans. This is basically the 50s, a time, I think, when patriotism was a very common value, and patriotism equated to seeing military service as not simply honorable, but almost a part of what it meant to be a citizen. So I grew up in that kind of an environment. When it came time to go to college, I had choices. And I think, I mean, I went to West Point not because I thought I was going to be a career officer, but because I was attracted to what they had to offer, and I thought I'd save my parents a bunch of money by being able to pay for my own education.
And they not only paid for your education, but they paid you to go there, I assume. Is it the same way it is now?
Yeah, you get I mean, it equates to a stipend, but it's spending money and more than spending money, yes.
Where did you grow up in Illinois and in Indiana?
Well, I was born in Normal, Illinois, spent a little time in Chicago when my dad was in medical school. And then when my dad graduated from medical school, he served in the Army for a year as an intern in Hawaii. And when we returned from Hawaii in 1954, we returned to where he grew up in the northwest corner of Indiana, around East Chicago and Hammond.
Your years, total years from the freshman year at the West Point to the time you got out of the service, what were those years?
1965. So I became a cadet in the summer when we were first ratcheting up the U.S. combat role in Vietnam. 1965 until the summer of 1992. That's when I left the Army.
So go back to the Vietnam experience. What did you think of the Vietnam War going in? And you went in 1970. Mm-hmm. And then what did you think of it after you spent a year there?
Well, I think to answer the question, I have to put it in a little bit broader context and put it in the context of the 1960s. So I just mentioned that my classmates and I showed up at West Point in the summer of '65. And in a sense, we missed the 1960s. We lived a relatively insulated and isolated existence at the military academy at the time, while outside the gates of the military academy, in many respects, the country was coming apart. Coming apart because of the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, also coming apart, though, because of assassinations, of racial unrest, of a emergence of a counterculture. So we were aware of the fact that all of this was going on outside the gates, but we were relatively untouched by all of that. In that sense, being a cadet at West Point in the latter part of the 1960s was kind of a strange experience. Now, certainly the thing that interested us most as cadets was the war. I mean, I vividly remember that at dinner, all cadets eat together in a very large dining hall. At dinner, when they made the nightly announcements, they would announce the members of the previous class or the previous two classes who'd just been killed. So there was this constant reminder to us that we were entering an army that was at war, and Vietnam was, given the fact that it was a protracted war, was the experience that awaited us. What also became apparent as we were there is that the war was not going well. It was not simply that it was unpopular at home, but it was being mismanaged in the field, and mismanaged from Washington. Now, I wouldn't say as a 19-year-old I would have been able to articulate the ways in which it was being mismanaged, but obviously this was not going to turn out to be World War II and end with a surrender ceremony on a battleship. The Tet Offensive, early 1968, happens in our junior year, and in many respects the Tet Offensive is the turning point in terms of the American experience in Vietnam. It's at that point when even the Johnson administration acknowledges that we're no longer fighting to win. What we're fighting for is not clear, but we're not fighting to win. So by the time my class graduates and we deploy, most of us in spring, summer of 1970, we deploy to a war that we know will not be won. We deploy to a war that we really have no intention of winning any longer. And it turns out that we deploy to an army in Vietnam that is racked with racial tension, drug problems, disciplinary deterioration, and that makes it a difficult experience. So what did I think at the time? Well, at the time I think I was probably confused and in some senses didn't want to think too deeply about the war, its origins, its conduct, and its prospects. Because to think too deeply about those questions would be to confront some difficult matters. So it was a little bit easier, I think, to try to do your job. Try to be a good soldier. And don't consider the larger implications of the entire Vietnam experience. I don't know if that's the way my classmates handled it, but that's the way I handled it. So I tried to do my best during my year, come home in one piece, and then go on with my life.
When you went to Vietnam, second or first lieutenant?
I had just become a first lieutenant.
What part of Vietnam were you stationed in, and what was your job?
Well, one of the things was going on. The war was drawing down, and so President Nixon, he was the president by the time I got there, would periodically go on TV and make an announcement that another 40,000, 60,000 U.S. forces were going to come home. The effect of that was that units were closing down in Vietnam. And the effect of that on the individual was you might be assigned to this unit for your first 6 months, and then when that unit stood down, you'd go to another unit for the next 6 months. That's what happened to me. So I served in the 2nd Squadron, 1st Cavalry in a little town called Song Mao, not too far from the coast, for roughly the first 3 months. And then I was transferred to 1st Squadron, 10th Cavalry, which was in the Central Highlands, centered on the town of An Khe. And the 1st Squadron 10th Cavalry's mission was to secure a highway, QL-19, that ran from the city of Quy Nhon on the coast through the Central Highlands to Pleiku and Kon Tum. So our job was to keep that highway open. I was a platoon leader in Song Mao. Then I was a platoon leader in An Khe. And in the latter part of my tour, I was a an operations officer in the squadron headquarters.
I'm going to come right back to this, but from 1990 until 2013, what kind of work have you been in?
From 1992, when I got out of the Army, to the present, I guess I've been an academic and a writer. I spent 6 years here in Washington at the School of Advanced International Studies. It was kind of my academic apprenticeship. I was running a little research institute and doing some teaching at SAIS. Very grateful for that opportunity. And then in 1998, Boston University invited me to join the faculty. So I've been at Boston University since 1998, and that really has been a life-transforming opportunity for me. It's a wonderful place.
You describe yourself in a conversation you had at Boston University in 2010 as a conservative Catholic. Is that still the way you feel?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people in conversation with me work on the assumption that since I went to West Point and was a soldier, those must be sort of the formative experiences in my life, and they were important experiences. But I think in many respects, what's more important is I was born and raised in the Midwest, in the so-called heartland. I was raised in a seriously Catholic household. And I remain a Catholic. It's an important thing to me, and I am a conservative. But I'm not a conservative in the sense that people who are adherents to the Republican Party claim to be conservatives. I personally think that that what passes for conservatism in this country is anything but conservative. So I would have a somewhat different definition of what it means to be conservative than I think most people. The notions that come to people's mind when they hear that word spoken.
Further define what you mean by conservative.
Well, I think first of all, begin with the notion that conservatives value our inheritance, and they wish to maintain, to preserve, to conserve that inheritance. The inheritance is intellectual. The inheritance is cultural, it's social, and it's material, the world. So to me, a conservative ought to be an environmentalist, among other things. I mean, generally speaking, in our politics, environmentalism is kind of seen to be something that people on the left adhere to, and that people on the right scoff at. I think that's utterly wrong. Conservatives should be tree huggers, to put it that way. In terms of social values, I'm a traditionalist, and I understand that there are very powerful cultural forces in our country that are dismissive of of the social structures that we have received from past generations. Frankly, those forces are so powerful that there's no turning them back. It's foolish to think that. To take gay rights as an example, it's foolish to think that one is going to restore traditional norms in that regard. That said, I think that we are too quick to overthrow these received norms and are not sufficiently aware of what some of the downsides are going to be. I think a conservative in the realm of foreign policy ought to be a realist, ought to bridle at the notion that there is some great American mission whereby we're going to redeem or transform the world. I think a conservative should be exceedingly wary of war and also somewhat skeptical of military institutions. Wary of war because war is, at the end of the day, uncontrollable. And there may be times when you need to fight. But the notion that you should see war as a desirable instrument of policy, that's not a conservative perspective from my point of view. And we should, although we certainly should respect soldiers, conservatives should be wary of military institutions because conservatives generally ought to be concerned about any large conglomeration of power. Conservatives should favor the distribution of power rather than the concentration of power. And the greatest concentration of power in our country, in our time, is a concentration of power around the military. And therefore, instead of conservatives throwing money at the Pentagon, which they tend to favor doing. Conservatives should be those at the forefront of watching the Pentagon. Not because we hate soldiers, on the contrary, but because, as the founders of this republic correctly identified, the concentration of military power can constitute a threat to liberty.
In the back of your book, it talks about the American Empire Project. And it writes of some of the other people that are writing for that project: Noam Chomsky, Chalmers Johnson, who is deceased, yourself, James Carroll, Michael Clare, and others. And most of those people would not be categorized as conservative. Why? Let me just ask you this: why would you be a part of that group? And what is the American Empire Project?
Well, it's not my project, but it's a series of books. I'm happy to be part of it. I'm thrilled to be part of it. The American Empire Project is a series of books published by Metropolitan Books. That's my publisher. The series conceived of by two guys, one of whom is named Tom Engelhardt. And Tom is my editor, and he's also my friend. And Tom is emphatically a person of the left in every aspect of his politics. And why am I there and still claiming to be a conservative? I think the answer is, in a sense, the answer I gave before is I think there are conservatives and principled people on the left can make common cause and should make common cause in arguing for greater restraint in the way we think about and employ our military. So Tom and I don't necessarily agree on, I suppose, abortion, but we do agree that this excessively militarized approach to foreign policy that has evolved over the last 60 or so years and kind of reached its high point after 9/11, that this is not good for the country. And therefore, one of the themes of the American Empire Project is to critique this militarism from different perspectives.
At the beginning of the introduction, you talk about a Captain William Reichert. What's that story?
Well, Reichert was a member of the Class 68 from West Point. And when I got to 1st Squadron, 10th Cavalry, he was a troop commander. I was not in, he was a troop commander of C Troop, and I was in D Troop. And I did not know him well. I had not known him at all until I showed up at On K. But over the course of my tour, he was murdered. He was murdered by an American soldier assigned to the 1st Squadron, 10th Cavalry. And this was at the time a shocking episode, an eye-opening episode, and one of the aspects of my Vietnam experience that stuck with me. And I had wanted for some time to, however briefly, tell his story, because I think the story is an important one, and I think that his murder by an American soldier shouldn't be forgotten. And the event is, to some degree, emblematic of the times. And so that's something that I included in the introduction.
But how did he get murdered by an American? And is it murder or was it a mistake?
No, it was murder. The perpetrator had words with Captain Reichert. And I believe, I can't say this for sure, the words had to do with allegations that the perpetrator was involved in a barracks theft. This is...
Enlisted man?
Yes, a private.
I think it's
helicopter mechanic.
Malloyer or something like that? Wait a minute, the name of the
Moyler.
Moyler.
Yeah, Moyler. Broad daylight, on the firebase, meaning not on patrol, but Moyler had his M16, and he shot and he killed Reichert in front of Reichert's orderly room. Now, Moyler was immediately detained, arrested, charged, convicted, sent to prison, never heard of again. I tried to find out what happened to him. I was unable to do so. Reichert disappeared. His remains were removed, and things more or less went back to normal.
Any publicity on this at the time, and how did you remember this?
Virtually none. One of the things I did for the book is to go back and check Stars and Stripes. You know, Stars and Stripes is this newspaper that's been published for deployed forces ever since World War II. And during Vietnam War, there was a European edition of Stars and Stripes for people in Germany and Europe, and there was this Pacific edition of Stars and Stripes. So I went and checked the Pacific edition of Stars and Stripes to find out how this shocking event was reported, and the answer, it was barely reported. There was like one short article mentioning this attack, providing minimal detail, other than, I found very interesting, making a brief reference to other attacks by enlisted soldiers on officers that had also happened very recently in Vietnam. So it's not that the attack on Captain Reichert was a one-off event. Rather, it was indicative of the deterioration of order and discipline that afflicted the Army in Vietnam at that time.
I want to run a piece of video of President Obama a couple years ago at a State of the Union message saying some things about the condition of our country, and then get your reaction to it.
Okay.
America is back. Anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone who tells you that America is in decline or that our influence has waned, doesn't know what they're talking about. Yes, the world is changing. No, we can't control every event. But America remains the one indispensable nation in world affairs, and as long as I'm president, I intend to keep it that way.
What's your take on that?
Well, you know, you'd like to be able to peer into the president's heart and soul and to know if he really meant those words. He was saying what he has to say. He is saying what an American president is expected to say, making claims of our uniqueness that have become very commonplace in our politics. It's striking, of course, is his use of the phrase indispensable nation, first coined by Madeleine Albright back when she was Secretary of State, and embraced by Bill Clinton when he became president. And it's to make the claim at the present moment, I think, is to, in effect, say that there is no need for us to think seriously about the implications of our failures over the past decade, in particular our foreign policy and national security failures. And I'm referring here to specifically to the Iraq War, but also by extension to the Afghanistan War. President's giving Americans, or his listeners at least, permission to forget all that and to pretend that they didn't happen.
After you saw what was going on in Vietnam, which was early in your career, why did you make a career out of the Army?
In some respects, because I didn't have the gumption to get out. I had gotten married right before I deployed, probably foolishly. And by the time my obligation, the obligation that I incurred by graduating from West Point, by the time my obligation was up, we had 2 children, 2 little kids, and the economy was a little bit soft. And I don't think I had the self-confidence at the time to say, well, I can go do something different, and I can make enough money to care for my family. And at the same time, the Army, in its infinite wisdom, offered me the opportunity to go to graduate school. They said, well, you know, look, we'll send you to graduate school, and then you can go teach at West Point for a while. And you know, that was going to take up a next chunk of years, and it was going to be a set of years when I would know that we were going to have a paycheck coming in. And by the time we got to the end of that next chunk of years. So now we're like at the 10-year mark of my service. My son had been born, so now we had 3 kids. And we seriously thought of getting out and then backed away from it. And, you know, life moves on and we have 4 kids. So it was only in the early 1990s that I finally came to the realization that I truly was not cut out to be a soldier in the first place. And that my wife, who I love dearly, basically at that point said, look, she'd never cared to be in the Army anyway, and made it pretty clear. We agreed, I should say, we agreed that it was time to move on. And so
here's another clip from former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld from the other side of the political fence. Tell us what you see here.
If you do not have standing task force capable of assuring you that in a very short period of time you can get into business in the event you need to be in business, you have substantially reduced the president's options. Conversely, if you do have it ready to go, capable of doing things, you may not only substantially increase the president's options, but you may very well provide options in the pre-war period, in the crisis period, that enables you to substantially affect the deterrent in a way that dissuades somebody from doing something that could cause that conflict.
Well, I think the phrase that he used that struck me most is he talked about these standing task forces doing things. Well, doing what? Now, in 2003, at the time that the Iraq War began, if we'd been able to say to Rumsfeld, Mr. Secretary, what do you mean by doing things? He probably would have said something to the effect that, well, I say doing things, I mean winning things. That there was an expectation that really emerged in the aftermath of Desert Storm back in 1991, seemingly confirmed by the early success in Afghanistan in 2001, that had created a very powerful expectation by 2003 that when we committed U.S. forces into combat, they're going to win. They're going to win quickly. They're going to win decisively. They're going to win economically. I mean, economically, both in terms of dollar cost and in terms of the sacrifices that would be imposed on U.S. forces. Now, were that in fact were those expectations to be valid, then sign me up. Sign me up. Give me some of those standing task forces that we can deploy when we, giving the president options. Perhaps, as Rumsfeld's suggesting, the knowledge of our adversaries that we can do this perhaps is going to cause them to think again. So if you can guarantee me a victory, sign me up. What's the problem? The problem is we tested that proposition in Iraq, and it turned out to be not the case. And indeed, despite the early evidence of success in Afghanistan, Afghanistan also turns out to be a case that doesn't demonstrate that we can win victories. This is the when the president in the earlier clip is talking about we're the indispensable nation, and what he doesn't want us to talk about, what does he want Americans to contemplate? What he doesn't want Americans to contemplate is we don't know how to win wars. We have, by virtually any measure, the best military in the world. We certainly spend more on our military than basically the rest of the world put together. But we don't know how to win wars. And it seems to me that there really ought to be a very serious national conversation to ask, why is that the case? Where does the fault lie? Is it our politicians are too stupid? Is it our generals are inept? Is it the size of the forces are too small? Or is it, and this is my belief, is it the fact that by its very nature, war is unpredictable? To go to war is to roll the dice. And you might win, and you might not. And if you view war as simply rolling the dice, well then, again, and this is what I think conservatives should believe, then you really only should do this when it's absolutely necessary. And you need to go in with your eyes wide open, because it's not going to go the way you think it's going to go.
You write about the following in your book, but this was back in 2004. General Eric Shinseki at the time, I believe he was head of the Army.
He was Chief of Staff of the Army.
Chief of Staff of the Army, who's now head of the Veterans Administration in the Obama administration. Yeah. But here's what he said at a hearing, and shortly after that, he went away for a long time. We didn't have any idea of a follow-up. He didn't talk about this, but let's watch this.
Could you give us some ideas to the magnitude of the Army's force requirement for an occupation of Iraq following a successful completion of the war?
In specific numbers, I would have to rely on combatant commanders' exact requirements, but I think...
How about a range?
I would say that what's been mobilized to this point, something on the order of several 100,000 soldiers are probably a figure that would be required. We're talking about post-hostilities, control over a piece of geography that's fairly significant, with the kinds of ethnic tensions that could lead to other problems, and so it takes a significant ground force presence.
In footnote 55 in your chapter 6, you say Paul Wolfowitz dismissed Shinseki's concerns as, quote, wildly off the mark, unquote, remarking, by the way, of a rebuttal that, quote, it's hard to conceive that it would take more forces to provide stability in post-Saddam Iraq than it would to conduct the war itself and to secure the surrender of Saddam's security forces and his army. What's this all? What happened to General Shinseki after that?
Well, Shinseki basically was silenced, and the episode, of course, is a very famous one. It's famous in part because events vindicated Shinseki and made Mr. Wolfowitz look like a bit of a fool. But I think what's important about the episode, to appreciate the importance of the episode, you have to appreciate, in a sense, the ideological context in which this debate, let's call it the Shinseki-Wolfowitz debate, the ideological context in which the debate occurs, and the ideological context has two dimensions. The first dimension is that Wolfowitz came from a political camp, generally referred to as the neoconservatives, who were committed to the proposition that the United States possessed the capacity to export democracy, and that nations living under autocrats like Saddam Hussein yearned to be liberated and to embrace democracy. And that therefore our capacity and their yearning would combine to make this transition to democracy relatively neat and easy. And Shinseki is saying, ain't going to happen that way. So that's one reason why Wolfowitz would go after Shinseki. But there's a second reason, relating to a theory of war that also had come to be something of an ideology at this time. And the theory of war was one that basically said that advanced information technology, or forces equipped with advanced information technology, an ability to identify targets, to strike targets with great precision, to act with great speed, that the forces possessing these abilities would be able to win wars decisively and quickly, and as I suggested a little while ago, sort of neatly and economically. And the Iraq War was a full-scale test of that proposition. And here we are on the eve of the Iraq War, and Shinseki is saying, from an army perspective, I ain't buying that. I think it's going to be complicated and messy. So for both of those reasons, both the neoconservative commitment to the notion that we can export democracy, and this other notion that high-tech U.S. forces are going to be able to win quickly, he had gone way out of bounds.
I want to make sure that I correct what I said. I said 2004. It was the 2004 defense budget, but he made that statement on February the 25th, 2003, right
Correct.
before the March.
That's correct. Before the invasion. That's correct.
You write in your book about a famous name in history, in military history, Lieutenant General Smedley Butler.
Major General Smedley Butler.
Excuse me. I gave him another stripe. Major General Smedley Butler. Who was he, and why did you write about him?
Well, he's a fantastic character. He was a Marine. He was a Marine who served basically from the beginning of the first outward thrust of American empire, the Spanish-American War and its aftermath. Served through the well into the 1930s. Twice won the Medal of Honor. Although he participated in World War I, his role in World War I was not really significant. The real sort of fabric of Smedley Butler's career was in policing the American empire, participating in the Boxer expedition in China, invading and occupying various Caribbean islands, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, an instrument of U.S. foreign policy, and he was good at it. But what makes him of such great interest to historians is that virtually the day after he took off his uniform and became a civilian, he publicly announced that all of that service, actually he'd been a gangster. I think the phrase is a gangster in service of capitalism. That he said out loud what critics of American foreign policy had been saying throughout this period, that U.S. foreign policy basically exists to serve the interests of Wall Street. So he became a controversial truth teller in his way, and is fondly remembered by anti-war people in this country down to the present moment. Now, I use him in the book. I said that he's the originator of what I call Smedley's syndrome, which is the tendency of at least some senior military officers to change their minds when they take off their uniform, and to suddenly speak truths that when they were still on active duty they would have not spoken. He's an example of that. I cite some other examples of that. But I really do that in order to cite the most recent example, and that is General William McChrystal.
Stanley McChrystal.
Excuse me, General Stanley McChrystal. That Stanley McChrystal, famous as the commander of Special Operations Forces in the Iraq War, famous as somebody who then became the commander in Afghanistan only to be fired after about a year on the job. Once he retired, he came out and announced that he thought that the all-volunteer force was a bad idea.
Let's let him speak for himself at an Aspen Ideas Conference in 2012 on this subject.
My guess is we're not going to get a draft through. But what is your take on some sort of mandatory national service?
I am becoming a little bit more extreme on this each year. Right now, I think everybody 56 years old and younger ought to have to serve 2 years. I'm 57. No, what I really believe is I think we need national service, and I think you need it either at the conclusion of high school or university.
People cheered that.
They did.
You think they meant it?
I don't know. I agree with General McChrystal. But I'm curious why he waited until he was no longer on active duty to announce his support for national service. Had he done that when he was a serving four-star general, that would have been interesting. That might have triggered a very interesting conversation. Now he's a retired four-star and he goes out to Aspen and he spouts off and he gets polite applause, but I don't think anybody really much cares what he has to say any longer. That's Smedley's syndrome in action. If you had this important insight, why didn't you share it with us when you actually could have done something about it?
Well, just for kicks, why don't I ask you the same question? You spent 23 years in the service. Why didn't you do something about the way you felt about the book here says breach of trust when you were in the service? You stayed 23 years.
Yeah, and a fair question. And I think the answer is my own short-sightedness. That through the time when I was serving into the early 1990s, I was not able to discern the snares that this reliance on a standing army was going to get us in. Now, again, going back to my time of serving in the latter part of the Cold War, when the army in which I served was rebuilding from the catastrophe of Vietnam. And the rebuilding, in many respects, was a great success in terms of better level of training, better quality soldiers, better discipline, higher morale, better esprit. So that by the time I got to the latter part of my career in the 1980s and into the 1990s, it was not difficult to command a unit in the sense that you had these wonderful people who really wanted to soldier. That's the army I left in 1992. Now, what didn't I see that I wish in retrospect I had seen? Well, what I didn't see was that once the Cold War ended, both some politicians and some generals would work hard to find ways to put this wonderful army to work. When deterring the Soviet Union was no longer the principal task confronting the Pentagon, but when all this capacity was available, people in the Pentagon, people in the White House, people in the State Department sat down and thought real hard about, well, what can we do with this capacity? And they needed to find something to do with it in order to justify its continued existence. And so this led to the emergence of some very pernicious ideas. One of those pernicious ideas was the notion that technology can enable us to win wars quickly and neatly with great levels of assurance. Another pernicious idea is the notion that we should be using these forces to project American power rather than to defend ourselves and defend our allies.
I just want to interrupt a second. This is only 30 seconds, and it's right about the time that you got out of the service, and it's the defense spending cuts discussion in the Congress, and this is former Chief of Staff of the Army, General Gordon Sullivan. This is going to say some of the same things you have, but this is 1992.
Previously, we trained for attrition warfare with structured organizations backed up by the mobilized potential of this nation. Today, we train for decisive victory in tailorable organizations of mixed components. The power of the microprocessor, the microchip, leverages our human potential. Yesterday, mass was the key to warfare. Today, precision is the key to warfare. Controlling the dimensions of speed, space, and time, applying decisive combat power at the critical point.
When you see him say that today, this is, 21 years later, what do you think he would say today about what he said then?
Well, I hope he would say, gosh, I was naive. Gosh, I got it wrong, and how I regret that. I mean, the clip we just saw was a nice, succinct expression of that conception of warfare that I tried to describe a little while ago. And that conception of warfare informed people's expectations for how the Iraq War was supposed to go. Guess what? It didn't. We didn't win a decisive victory. And what we ended up with is a protracted war that Sullivan's army was not properly trained for and not properly sized for. That's crucial. Sullivan says mass doesn't matter. Well, in Iraq and Afghanistan, mass does matter in the sense that if you're going to be able to pacify these countries, it's going to require a substantial number of soldiers to do that. But having abandoned our tradition of the citizen soldier in the wake of Vietnam, having embraced this model of a standing army of professionals, we found ourselves with no easy way to expand the force in order to take on this mission that Sullivan was not able to anticipate. With what consequences? Well, among the consequences, number one, repeated combat tours, sending people back again and again and again with terribly adverse effects on their well-being, and also in an effort to sort of make up for this gap between too much war, not enough warriors, insert contractors into that gap. Basically privatize warfare to a very considerable extent, turning over to private contractors who are in the business to make money, turning over to them tasks that normally would have been allotted to soldiers, and with incredible waste. Where, you might say, where are the American people in all this? Well, the American people are on the sidelines. They're in the grandstands. They're cheering. They're putting bumper stickers on their cars saying support the troops. But as in a substantive sense, they are disengaged. They're disengaged from their army. They're disengaged from war itself. And the consequences didn't produce victory and haven't produced any substantial benefits for the country. I would argue, I try to argue in the book, that in fact this reliance on a professional army that is disengaged from the people, that permits officials in Washington to engage in unnecessary wars, has depleted American power. The earlier clip said that President Obama says that people who say that we're in decline don't know what they're talking about. Well, I take issue with the president. I mean, I think there's plentiful evidence that the country is in serious trouble. There are lots of reasons why we're in serious trouble. One of the reasons we're in serious trouble is that we have developed this proclivity for wars, this compulsion to use force in ways that don't produce positive outcomes. And there's a lot of, a considerable amount of thinking that really ought to be happening in Washington to try to figure out how we got in this mess and how we got out. That's why one of the things that just outrages me is the fact that the inclination in Washington, indulged by the American people, is to forget about the failures, to not think about, to not try to identify the serious lessons of the Iraq War. Frankly, not even to identify the serious explanations for why 9/11 happened. It's very disturbing.
What were the circumstances that your son lost his life in Iraq?
Well, I've made it a policy not to talk about that, and only because it seems to me that these are private matters, and we're better off just letting them stay that way.
But isn't that a factor in the way you feel about all this?
Well, I imagine it is. And if prior to May 13th of 2007 I'd been a gung-ho supporter of the war, and on the day after I became a war critic, then you might say it had a decisive impact. But the truth is, I was a critic of the war before my son was killed. And of course, how could something like that not affect one's outlook? But I don't think that it had a decisive effect.
Well, the reason I brought it up is that you told us when we started this discussion that you sat there in the food hall at the
mess hall.
The mess hall, I'm sorry, at West Point. And they would, I wanted to ask you, why would they announce the number of West Point grads that had been killed in Vietnam?
Well, they were not announcing the number, they were announcing the names.
The name. Well, why would they do that, though? When you're sitting there training to go to war, what was the point?
Well, nobody explained to me what the point was. But I would think that the point would be to, as an act of homage, that here is someone who once marched in your ranks. That person has now forfeited his life for his country. Let us at least acknowledge that that has happened. In retrospect, I don't find it inappropriate. In retrospect, I think it was more than appropriate.
Didn't even mean to imply it was inappropriate, but it would be interesting to know what the impact that had on you. You're sitting there having a meal, and all of a sudden, Tom Smith dies in Vietnam. But move ahead to your son dying. Most Americans didn't see anybody in Iraq or Afghanistan get wounded or killed. And there were 6,500, I think, both in Iraq and Afghanistan total killed, and another 7,000 that were wounded. How much did that have as an impact versus the Vietnam where there was a draft on the American people?
Well, I mean, this is something that I write about in this book, and quite frankly, I've tried to insert into previous books, that the unintended consequence of abandoning the tradition of the citizen soldier and instituting our so-called all-volunteer army, misnamed our professional army, the unintended consequence was to allow a separation between the American people and the American military to occur, a gap. And one manifestation of that gap is that, if we take the complaint of the Occupy Wall Street, it's the 1%, the rich people, the 1% are exploiting the 99%. Well, when it comes to war, we have the reverse. We have the 99% exploiting the 1%. The 1% who serve, who are sent to these wars, many of which should not be fought, none of which are being won. 1% bears the burden of service and sacrifice, and the other 99% watch. And that is not democratic, and I think it is profoundly immoral. And I think it's going to continue to be the case as long as we maintain this all-volunteer force. And the solution is the solution that General McChrystal identified, I think, to institute a program of national service in which all will serve, all able-bodied 18-year-olds will serve, some of them serving in the military, others serving in other capacities, but all of them serving the country for a period of time, as a means to reconstitute a more vigorous definition of citizenship, and as a means to ensure that the army that we send is an army of the people, that is representative of a cross-section of the American people. And I think that is something that needs to be part of our political debate.
I want you to watch this short 40-second clip of President George Bush talking about Tommy Franks, who was very much involved in the Iraq War, getting the Medal of Freedom, and he's sitting there with George Tenet and I think Don Rumsfeld. I'm not sure, but let's watch this and get your reaction to this.
The general likes to say that no plan ever survived the first contact with the enemy. But in Iraq, Tommy Franks' plan did. A force half the size of the force that won the Gulf War defeated Saddam Hussein's regime and reached Baghdad in less than a month, the fastest, longest armored advance in the history of American warfare. Today, the people of Iraq and Afghanistan are building a secure and permanent democratic future. One of the highest distinctions of history is to be called a liberator, and Tommy Franks will always carry that title.
The other person, I think, it was not Don Rumsfeld. He's probably in the audience, but may have been Paul Wolfowitz. But anyway, the Medal of Freedom to Tommy Franks. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's a travesty. I mean, the narrative of the Iraq War that the president just gave us was, to put it mildly, incomplete. Franks did succeed in toppling Saddam Hussein, but that was not sufficient. It was not sufficient to either achieve our political purposes or to provide deliverance to the Iraqi people. I mean, Iraq today is coming apart at the seams, with hundreds, on a monthly basis, hundreds of Iraqis being killed by the renewed insurgency.
So the
barely makes the paper.
Whole thing was a waste of time? Waste of money, waste of...
I think, well,
Americans?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I understand the response. The world is a better place because Saddam Hussein is gone. I suppose that's true.
Were these men evil that got us involved in there? I pull evil out of the air, but I mean, how would you describe?
They were arrogant and they were naive, and it's hard to understand in a way, because you remember when the Republicans won the 2000 election, well, part of the Republican critique of the Democrats during the Clinton era was that when the Democrat national security team was like amateur hour, and that what the Republicans portrayed themselves as the people who understand how the world works. And we were going to bring in these seasoned operators like Rumsfeld on a second tour as Secretary of Defense, Colin Powell becoming the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, National Security Advisor. Heck, Dick Cheney was the Vice President. These were the people who supposedly understood how the world really worked and therefore could be trusted to make prudent and wise decisions. And that's why it's so hard to understand their arrogance and their naivete. But that's the label they will carry into history, and the label that Tommy Franks will carry will be incompetent.
Who's the last politician you thought knew what they were doing and you could vote for?
Well, I voted for Barack Obama twice, but I voted for Barack Obama because, you know, when you get to an election, it's either this guy or that guy, and it seemed to me that Obama was a preferable alternative. But in terms of the last president who I think deserves respect, I think I'd probably say I like Ike. Now, he had his own flaws and did some pretty stupid things in Iran, in Guatemala. He's the guy who sort of teed up the ball for John Kennedy when it came to the Bay of Pigs, which was foolish. But when you look at the 8 years of the overall, and make an overall judgment of the 8 years of the Eisenhower presidency, he did pretty darn well.
You say that basically the Washington establishment, I wrote this down, says, quote, trust us, we know what we're doing, unquote.
Well, I think that that's the attitude I sense. And what I mean is this, that over the course of the Cold War and into the post-Cold War period, there emerged this notion that national security affairs, broadly speaking, was complex. And to be able to contribute to the making of national security policy, you need to acquire expertise. You need to be an insider. You have to have access to the classified administration. And if you buy that notion, then the role of the American people in the formulation of national security policy is basically to defer, to look to Washington for guidance. And it seems to me that if you look at the performance of our national security establishment, in particular in the post-Cold War era, there's no justification for saying that somebody who has a high-ranking position in the Defense Department is any smarter than my late-departed Aunt Betty Lou, who lived her entire life in Morrison, Illinois. So I'd like to see Americans become a lot more willing to ask hard questions and to not defer. I don't see any signs that's going to happen, but I think that's what we need.
The book is called Breach of Trust. Is this your what book?
I don't remember, but
7, 8?
Something like that, yeah.
And you are a professor at Boston University?
I am.
And have been there since 1998? Andrew Bacevich, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.